In this video, we're going to be talking about God the perception. Now, this is especially interesting because unlike the other ways to conceptualize God, God the perception is the only one that is purely phenomenological or purely psychological. So with that said, we might as well begin by comparing it to other ways to conceptualize God. I won't spend a whole lot of time on these, but we have God the Creator, God the Supreme Personality of Godhead, God the unity of all substance or the pantheistic God, God as being incapable of divine intervention, which is the deist God, God as maximal greatness or ultimate concern, which is Paul Tillich's God. And what I'm trying to get at, what I think is so interesting, is that if you view God as a perception, you're not really using induction to come to God, because with all of these other concepts, you're using induction to show that God is this, God is that. But here you're simply saying, I'm using my sensory faculties to sense God or to perceive God. And that's what this video is about. And so the question is, how well does psychological perceptions of God match with philosophical conceptualizations of God? And that is a really difficult question to answer. Is the psychological perception of a living God evidence of the existence of God? And with God being defined as one of the previous philosophical conceptions of God described in the previous slide. So what does that mean? Basically what I'm asking is, how well does this map on to this? So someone can perceive God, and they can say that God is in my life. I know because God is with me. But that doesn't show that God is the creator of the universe, that God is maximal greatness. It doesn't show that God is omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscience, or omniscience, oh my goodness, omniscient. That's how you pronounce it. It doesn't show that God is anything that begins with omni. And that's a problem with God as a perception, is that there's still a lot of questions that are left as unknown. So before I get myself in trouble, if I haven't already, we need to give a more formal definition of what perceiving God is. What is God the perception? So I have an operational definition right here. I'll read it out loud. The perception of God is the perception, 1, of an ethereal being beyond the senses. 2, that this ethereal being embodies intrinsic meaningfulness. And 3, that this ethereal being embodies the oneness or connectedness of all things. And lastly, 4, that there exists a loving relationship between the perceiver and the ethereal being. And in order to perceive God, the perceiver must be able to perceive the existence of other individuals, because God is an individual. They must be able to perceive the existence of that which is ethereal, since God is ethereal. And they must be able to perceive intrinsic meaning, since God embodies intrinsic meaning. They must be able to perceive the oneness and connectedness of all things, because that's what God is also. And lastly, they must be able to have a loving relationship, because that is what is required to perceive God. Debatably, you can't have a relationship with God unless it's a loving relationship. Right? Now, someone might disagree with that. They might say, well, someone can hate God, right? But that's always going to be one way. God can never hate you back. And in my opinion, the only true perception of God is that of a loving perception. So if you're perceiving God and you hate God, then you're not actually perceiving God. So, the perception of God requires these 5 root ingredients. And it's like cooking with perceptions. If you're able to perceive all 5 of these things, then you can combine them, and the combination of these things will automatically produce the perception of God. That is my theory. But it's a purely psychological theory. This is not philosophical yet. Because if you're able to perceive God, if you're able to combine these ingredients to perceive God, that still doesn't show that God is this or that. It doesn't show that God created the universe. It doesn't show that God is omnipotent or omni this, omni that. And it doesn't really show that God even exists. And so with that said, let's look at what is perceivable and what is not perceivable at all about what we would call the perception of God. And so one thing that is guaranteed to be perceivable is meaningfulness. Even if you're a nihilist and you don't think that meaning exists, you still cannot deny that some people perceive meaningfulness. You might think it's an illusion, but you can't deny that people still perceive it. And so we can say that people perceive meaning in their life. So we can perceive the existence of other individuals. We can perceive that a loving relationship is occurring with that individual. And we can perceive, I'll say we cannot perceive the oneness and connectiveness of all things. That's logically impossible. Now, if you have people who are on mushrooms, on LSD, they will say things like they perceive the oneness of all things. That's not actually true. That's a misinterpretation of a different perception. Because in order to perceive the oneness of all things, you have to perceive all things. And then only once you perceive all things, then you can perceive that there's connectedness between all things. So maybe you can perceive the connectedness of some things and then accidentally misinterpret that perception as the oneness of all things. Moving on. Now, for the same reason that you can't perceive the oneness of all things, you can't perceive the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That would require you to perceive all of Godhead, all personalities, to perceive something that embodies every personality available to exist. You have to be able to perceive all those personalities. That is simply not possible. And so, if someone is having a perception of God, and if it's a true perception, if they're actually perceiving God and it's not merely illusory, they're not going to perceive all of God. They're going to perceive a little component of God that's made available to their feeble human mind. So then there are things which are debatably perceivable, things that I haven't really made up my mind about whether or not it's possible to perceive these things, one of which is the existence of something which is ethereal. Now, I think it might be possible, believe it or not. I know it sounds kind of goofy, but I actually have a slide dedicated just to this, so I'll skip this and then come back to it later. Another thing that's debatably perceivable is intrinsic meaningfulness. Now, remember that I said in the previous slide, where is it? That God is, that God embodies intrinsic meaning. That in order to perceive God, you have to perceive something that's intrinsically meaningful. Well, one can perceive meaningfulness, but it's really, really, really hard to actually show that the thing you're perceiving as meaning is actually intrinsically meaningful. And why is that? Well, I'll explain using an analogy. Suppose that we have a jar of marbles, and we want to know which marble is the most red out of all the marbles. And so we take a handful of marbles and we say, hey, this marble is really red. I can't imagine that there could ever be a marble more red than this marble. But you haven't actually looked at the rest of the marbles to see if there are any more marbles more red than the one you've chosen. And likewise, if you're perceiving something that's really meaningful, and it's so meaningful that you're just convinced that it's intrinsic meaning, well, no human being actually knows the scope of what is or is not meaningful. And so it's impossible for them to actually know if what they're experiencing as meaning is intrinsic meaning, if that makes sense. Now, there is an exception to this. Now, let's suppose you grab a handful of marbles out of the jar, and then you run it through the lab, and you show that it's impossible for there to be a marble that's more red than the marble that you happen to have in your hand. That you analyzed the color of the marble, and you've shown that it's the perfect hue of red. Well, if it's possible to do something similar with meaning, then you can say that you can perceive intrinsic meaningfulness. And I don't know if that's possible, but I don't know that it's not possible. And so now we have to talk about what is not perceivable at all. So, omnipotence, omniscience, I think it's called omnipotence and omniscience, or any other word that starts with omni, these things are not perceivable. For the same reason why we can't perceive the oneness or connectedness of all things, and for the same reason we can't perceive the Supreme Personality of Godhead. To perceive any of these things, we have to perceive totality itself. It's simply not possible. We cannot perceive that God created or sustained the universe. Like before, this is simply beyond the scope of what is perceivable given our feeble human minds. Maybe we can perceive God telling us that he created the universe. That is not the same thing as perceiving that he created the universe. We cannot perceive the supreme personality of the supreme personality of Godhead. We cannot perceive the oneness and connectedness of all things. And we cannot perceive, this is most important, we cannot perceive other people's subjective perceptions of what God is to verify that we're all having the same perception. And that's sort of a problem with this to begin with, is that we don't know if this perception is universal among all humans or if it's subjective. So going back to my operational definition of the perception of God, I created that because those are the things that I perceive when I perceive God. I don't know if anybody else actually perceives those things. My assumption is that they do because of the similar psychological makeup that all human beings have. But I don't actually know that. I'm making a leap. I'm making a leap of faith, ironically, as you will. Okay, so moving on. So obviously this theory has many problems. But later I'm going to talk about how God the perception is still actually, it's still somewhat valid and you should take it seriously. But first, let's go over the problems. So the perception of God has quite a few problems. We'll start with the second biggest problem. The biggest problem being something we've already covered, that the perception of God doesn't really match to the philosophical or the philosophically induced conceptions of God. So we'll start with the second biggest problem. There's a thick gray line separating perception and belief. And in fact, sometimes it's really difficult to actually determine whether something is a perception or a belief. And the perception of God is an example of that. Another example of that could be the perception that someone has a crush on you. Maybe you can look at their facial expressions and look at their body language, and maybe you can infer something from that and then perceive that they have a crush on you. But the belief that someone has a crush on you is really not so different than the perception that they do. And in fact, the language is interchangeable. You could say, I believe this person has a crush on me, and I perceive that this person has a crush on me, and it would mean essentially the same thing. So moving on, top-down processing might override bottom-up processing, resulting in a sane delusion or a sane hallucination. And although the 5 ingredients of perception may be present, combining them to create God might be a sane hallucination, meaning that God is a product of top-down processing overriding perceptual faculties. Now, this has very little to do with the thick gray line of perception and belief, as we discussed earlier. This has more to do with whether we're seeing this illusory God, that when we combine all 5 of these perceptions, we perceive God, but that God is actually an illusion. It's a coincidence of the way the mind operates, and that we shouldn't take it too seriously. And this is a real possibility, because like I said before, it's really just about impossible to really translate the psychological perception of God onto a philosophical conception of God. And so how do we know that this perception is not illusory? Well, when I talk about the ethereal in this slide, I'm going to cover that and say, well, sure, it might be illusory, but there's actually evidence that it's not. But that doesn't mean that it's not. It just means that there's evidence that there's not. And also, one thing that we know for certain is that if we perceive something that's extremely meaningful, and if we have a relationship with that meaning, we don't actually have to call that God. It may seem like God, and we may perceive it as God, but the perception of this meaning cannot in of itself be illusory. And so that's something to keep in mind. So moving on, societal norms influence how top-down processing affects one's perception of God. What does this mean? Well, it means that to some degree, society will determine the way you perceive God. So if you're born in Tibetan culture, you might not even perceive God at all. What you will perceive might be something more aligned with Buddhism. Or if you're born in an atheist family within our culture, maybe you won't perceive God. Maybe you'll perceive, atheist spirituality or so on and so forth. And the point I'm trying to make is that this perception that we're calling God is surprisingly malleable, plastic, as we would say. There's no way to get around it. Now, the far left is going to say that society molds it quite a bit. The far right is going to say that society doesn't mold it, or at least it molds it very little. And for some reason, I know that this topic is political. It need not be political. Let me say right now that the degree to which society molds our perception of God is partial, and we can leave it at that. So, near-death experiences between cultures support non-compatible perceptions of the divine, and this is something I read in Sam Harris's Waking Up. Well, what he was essentially saying is that the culture you're born in determines the content of your near-death experiences if you have them. A lot of the details in these near-death experiences shouldn't be taken too seriously because, first of all, they're non-compatible. Like the near-death experience of a Hindu who is in the process of reincarnation will be completely different than the near-death experience of a Christian who's going to heaven. And this is something that we have to take into account, I'm essentially using this as an analogy. People's perceptions of God is going to influence based on culture, and it's reliably predictable. And so a lot of the details of this perception need not be taken seriously. Let's move on to the next slide where I defend the perception of God. Now, after going through all of these problems, you might ask, how could you possibly defend this? Well, here's how. So the argument is as follows. It doesn't really matter if not every single culture has a widespread perception of God. That's actually somewhat irrelevant. The fact that so many people in so many different cultures are perceiving a meaningful being that is ethereal indicates that there's something going on and that we shouldn't be immediately dismissive of it, even if to us it seems goofy or wacky. And so, perceptions are constructed from experiences. All things being equal, experiences represent real phenomena occurring in the real world. The function of perception is to create mental theories that explain our experiences, sensory or otherwise. An example of this would be this cube. The experiences we're having are of these little lines and the cubes, but what we're seeing are the invisible contours that connect components of this cube. And that's very important. We're not experiencing God per se. We're experiencing things like lovingness and meaning. God is essentially the perception of that. God is like seeing a cube from little dots with lines through them, as we have here. The mental theory that there's a cube here is analogous to the mental theory that there is an individual who exists outside of the popularly defined material world who is loving and is a source of intrinsic meaning. And like I said before, the mere fact that this sounds goofy is very weak evidence that this is not occurring. And the fact that people are having these experiences and the fact that God seems to be the sensible perception that arises from these experiences is, in fact, evidence that there is a God. Keep in mind that this is not evidence for a Christian or a Hindu God. Like I said before, it's evidence that there's something out there. It's not evidence that this thing that you're perceiving created the universe. It's not evidence that it's omni this or omni that. But it is evidence that our experiences and the perceptions that arise from our experiences should not be taken lightly. We should take them seriously. And to merely have a perception is at least evidence that that perception is not a hallucination or a delusion. Although it might be, we can use inductive reasoning to show that it isn't necessarily a mere illusion. Regarding the ethereal, I've decided not to cover these topics in this video, but I did make slides. So if you want to, you can pause the video and look at the slides and just read. But I will be making a video specifically on the ethereal to go along with this video. I strongly urge you to subscribe to my channel. Every subscription helps me out quite a bit because I'm just starting out as a YouTuber. And so I thank you for your generosity. And I hope you have a great rest of your day or night.